Tom, we've been discussing Israel's attempts to try and attack Iran's nuclear capability, hinder its ability to fire ballistic missiles, and also take out some of its top brass. Looking at all of those three aims, how successful have they been?
I think very successful in some areas, perhaps less so in others. And quite interesting, we've got almost a fourth flank opening up now in the last day or so, which is the Israelis hitting Iranian oil infrastructure, oil terminals. Now, that was considered an area that was incredibly inflammatory if the rest wasn't, because that directly targets Iran's economy. Pretty much their only ability to raise taxes is selling oil abroad and raise revenue. So that would do even more damage to the Ayatollah's regime. On the leadership decapitation front, they've been incredibly successful. They've taken out the head of the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the sort of elite hardline military force really that has run so much of Iran's response and certainly their proxies. They've taken out the army chief of staff, they've taken out the IRGC's head of intelligence, and they've been taking out Iranian nuclear scientists as well, civilians, 5 or 6 of them so far, the people who had the capacity, the knowledge to develop this weapons program. So they've been really successful. They haven't taken out Ayatollah Khomeini, very interestingly, because it was reported over the weekend that Donald Trump was asked by the Israelis, can we go for the supreme leader, can we go for the Ayatollah himself? And Trump very firmly vetoed that. But otherwise, Iran now will be in a state of complete disarray. There is no one left in charge. All those people are now gone. They're having to appoint new people. They are desperately worried about their own movements in case they get another missile on top of them. So it's really destructive. So they've done very well on that front. They've also been really successful taking out Iran's ability to hit back, so their ballistic missile launchers. But there's extraordinary bits of footage we got last week, at the end of last week, of Mossad agents, Mossad commandos in the desert, flying drones onto those missile launchers. That brilliant sort of military operation doing that. So their capacity has been diminished. They're still firing ballistic missiles into Israel, and they're getting through the Iron Dome. So they still can fight back. So that's probably quite successful. I think we can probably give that a sort of 6 out of 10. The area which I think is really interesting, though, is the point of this entire operation, which is Iran's nuclear capacity. How much of that have the Israelis really been able to destroy? And the answer is we don't know, because so much of this is underground and really quite deep underground. So the Israelis say they've hit Natanz, which is the big nuclear enrichment site, if you like, and that was the first hit on overnight on Thursday night. And you can see TV pictures of Natanz in flames and a real mess. The same with Isfahan. That was hit overnight Saturday, another big area. Fordow was also hit, a big processing area and a storage area in the mountains. But the Iranians also know the Israelis can do this, so the really important stuff, the very sensitive stuff, not just the buildings where people sleep and the offices and where the pen pushers or paper pushers might live, but where the actual centrifuges are, which spin very quickly to enrich uranium, they're hundreds of meters sometimes underground, really far underground. And we know so far, publicly, the Israelis don't have that kind of weaponry that can get that deep. There was a satellite picture, it's fascinating, that the IEA, in fact, published not so long back, showing the amount of displaced earth the Iranians removed from the Fordow site to give us some idea of just how deep they went. And they reckon there was enough earth displaced for the Iranians to dig down 80 to 100 meters. And that's an awful long way to go down. There's only one known bit of weaponry that can penetrate that deep, and it would have to be hit several times, one after the other, sort of an aerial pneumatic drill, if you like. And that's a bit of weaponry that the Americans have got called the MOP, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. And that's a 30,000-pound bomb. That's an absolutely massive bomb that can go through 5, 6, 7 floors of concrete. Still not 100 meters deep, but you hit that several times, you might get a bit closer. Now, the Israelis don't have that capacity. Only the Americans do. The Americans are not in this war yet. So, crucially, they would have done some damage to the nuclear infrastructure, but some reports over the last few days have estimated maybe only 20-25% of Iran's infrastructure for their nuclear weapons plan has been destroyed. And that just isn't enough for the very objectives of this mission.
And so the Israelis will really want the Americans to be involved in all of this. Thinking about Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy and the fact that he was pursuing quite vigorously a diplomatic route with this whole issue of Iran maybe having a nuclear weapon, is he anywhere near joining in on this? They haven't done so far.
And I think that is the simple biggest question of this entire thing. Will the Americans join this war? The Israelis would absolutely love them to. The Americans are already engaging in a defensive position, if you like. So American pilots, American Patriot batteries are already engaging Iranian missiles to stop them from hitting Israel. But they're not on offensive operations yet. They're not in any way targeting Iran. And Israel would love that. Strategically be hugely useful for them to pull the Americans into the war. Meanwhile, Iran would hate the Americans to join this war, not least because they don't want this highly powerful ordnance dropped on their nuclear facilities, but also they really don't want the Americans in the Middle East again. For 10, 20 years during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Americans were all over the Middle East. That really wound up the Iranians, and they felt very threatened by that. So they will do everything they possibly can not to encourage the Americans into this war. And so far, Donald Trump is holding the line. He's been pretty contradictory, as Donald Trump can be. His Truth Social statements are on one moment saying, we don't want this to happen, the next saying, we warned Iran, it was all my idea in the first place. But of late, during the G7 summit in Canada, he's also now urging caution with the other G7 leaders. So that is very much a crucial element still in play.
And trying to distance himself somewhat from what's happening. Quote from Truth Social on Sunday: "If we are attacked in any way, shape or form by Iran, the full strength and might of the US armed forces will come down on you at levels never seen before." That doesn't sound like somebody about to deploy US aircraft on offensive missions or personnel on offensive missions against Iran.
Because Donald Trump is making a crucial dividing line here, which is, you attack us, we will come for you. If you don't attack us, we might just stay out of this war. And I think Donald Trump's whole role in this is another podcast episode entirely, quite frankly, but it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's clear Donald Trump didn't want this to happen. On the very day he was making statements saying, we need to allow talks to happen, we don't want the Israelis to attack, and that night they did. So he looks a fool. The next morning he said, well, I knew this was coming, it was all my idea, and now he's sort of back on the fence again. So Donald Trump runs the risk of looking quite weak here, because Israel, a huge ally of the US, has blatantly, it would appear, ignored everything he'd said. So if you like, he's got to kind of keep ahead of the shark on this, got to keep ahead of US public opinion, largely pro-Israeli, although that's been changing a little bit, we've seen with Gaza. So it's a very tricky ride for him and a very, very far from ideal situation.
Do we know what he actually thinks about this? Or maybe all those people around him who are whispering in his ear? Because on the one hand, you've got Donald Trump, who's talked really tough about the influence of Iran in the region, but also you have a president who, quite like a Nobel Peace Prize, who has said only the other day that he doesn't believe in forever enemies and there are deals that can be done. What does he think about it?
Donald Trump's administration is notoriously split on this. On foreign policy, it's hugely divided. You have the hawks, who still hate Russia, still want Iran to be properly neutralised, and then you've got the MAGAs, who want America to be completely isolationist and don't want any part in any wars. And I think Donald Trump is personally more in the latter camp, because if you looked and listened to his campaign rallies, as I had to, and I was covering the election for too many months, every single rally would be all about, I'm going to be the peacemaker president. There were no wars on my watch between 2016 and 2020, used to say, which is actually not quite true, but certainly America didn't start any wars then. Absolutely, he wants this to be the peacemaker president. He wants to end the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, and he wants to end this nuclear standoff in Iran as well. And ideally, he'd love a Nobel Peace Prize. It may be a very hard thing for him to attain, but a new war starting in the Middle East, a state-on-state war between Israel and Iran with all the potential ramifications and escalations, absolutely not what he wants whatsoever, I don't think.
Best case scenario, first of all, if you are the quote-unquote West, if you're Keir Starmer, what happens in a dream world now?
In a dream world now, the shooting stops and there is some sort of truce brokered where both sides agree to stop throwing munitions at each other. I think that's quite difficult to see because it's been reported certainly that the Israelis have 14 days worth of operations that they've already planned. We're into day 4 or 5 now, so they've got a lot more to come and to throw at that. But that would be an ideal situation, and ideally a situation where Iran doesn't break out from its military symmetric response, just throwing missiles back at the Israelis, and into an asymmetric response, which is, for example, targeting ships in the Gulf of Iran, potentially trying to close the Straits of Hormuz, which are only about 30 miles wide, sink a couple of oil tankers there, and suddenly about a fifth of the world's global oil trade, which goes through those straits of Iran, between Iran and Oman, that tiny gap of water, that would cause a massive economic problem. Inflation would rocket, the price of oil would rocket, and suddenly the world could quite easily be tipped into a fresh global recession.
What about regime change? Would it was Starmer not like it if actually the Iranian, the shooting stopped, but the Iranian people rose up and toppled the Ayatollah?
And regime change is another really fascinating element into this, isn't it? Because it's no one's declared intention yet. Benjamin Netanyahu has given TV addresses over the weekend speaking directly to the Iranian people saying, now is your time to rise up. Clearly, much of the world would love the Ayatollahs to go, the fundamentalist regime to disappear, because they haven't been any good to, quite frankly, anybody if you're in the West for a very long time. The problem with regime change, of course, is what do you replace it with? And we've seen this so many times before in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. You topple a tyrant, a tyrannical regime, which Iran undoubtedly is, but you've got to have a new form, a stable form of government ready to take its place. Or even worse could happen. Civil war, warring factions, and they could take control of Iran's, not just oil, but also Iran's nuclear facilities. And you could even get to a far worse situation than you have now. So regime change, ideally, yes, but I think a lot of Western politicians would be very, very hard-pressed to say they really want that before they can see a plan for it first.
Yes. What about an absolute worst-case scenario? How does this spiral out of control?
Well, worst-case scenario is the Gulf closes, you have an economic crisis because Iran starts sinking ships, and that entire massively important global trading patch of water closes down. But then worse, obviously, the conflict goes nuclear. Now, that could happen one of two ways. Israel is a nuclear nation. It could strike at Tehran. I think it's highly unlikely they'll do that first. They won't do that as a preemptive attack. But we don't quite know how far Iran is in this development. Now, if you're the Iranian regime, if you're the Ayatollahs, you think, well, what have we got left? What's the only stick we've got left? Well, it was the stick we were trying very hard to perfect when Donald Trump got elected, building that nuclear capacity. And if those centrifuges, those storage plants deep under the mountains of Natanz or Isfahan aren't destroyed, you can bet your bottom dollar right now they have thrown everything they possibly can at it to speed that up, to try and get to the stage of nuclear breakout. And if they get to the stage of nuclear breakout, they just need to build a warhead. They don't even need to build a missile to put it on. You build a warhead that you can detonate, you put it in a suitcase, and you walk into central Tel Aviv with a dirty bomb, as it's known as, and you explode that. And then very suddenly, Israel will retaliate with a nuclear device, and then you're into a nuclear war. And that suddenly tips the world into certainly a nuclear holocaust, if not a full-blown Third World War very, very quickly. And that obviously is terrifying.
I'm Manveen Rana from The Story, a daily news podcast from The Times. Join me and my co-host Luke Jones for a deep dive into the big stories and investigations. Plus, each month, William Hague hosts an agenda-setting interview with a key newsmaker or big thinker. That's The Story, The Times daily podcast that brings you one remarkable story told in depth. Listen every weekday on The Times radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.